Did you know that you have a worldview? Now, I realize you maybe have never heard this word before, worldview. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. But worldviews are like water for fish. So fish swim in the water. They just live there. But it doesn't mean that they know anything about the water. They just know that this is where we live. This is our existence. We swim in this stuff. We move around. We breathe in it. And when we leave it, we're in trouble. Worldview is like that for us. It's what we live in. It's how we see the world. It's how we understand what happens and why it happens. Now, worldviews are shaped by social influences, family influences, and by what we believe. And so what this means is that even though we might share social space with people, because of different family convictions and beliefs, we might have slightly different worldviews. Now, worldview is one way of talking about it. I prefer to talk about the story that we live and believe. We all believe a certain story, and that story is how we understand the world. So because something happens to you and what you think about the world and the story that you believe and the story you tell yourself, even if you don't realize it, that story helps you make sense of what happened. It helps you make sense of who you are. It helps you make sense of what matters most in life. And so the question today we need to ask ourselves, what is the story that influences our life? Now, I recently read an author who talked about this, and he has a number of stories that compete with the gospel. The gospel story is a story that Christians live by. It's the story that helps us understand the world. And the gospel is the fulfillment of the story of God that is communicated to us right here. Now, the competing stories, maybe you've heard some of them, maybe you haven't, but you for sure have encountered them. The first one is the story of individualism. Now, this story says, I matter most before anything else. I mean, our country is built on the idea that each human has individual rights and freedoms. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but we can take it too far. The second story is the story of consumerism, which is a story that what I have and what I'm able to do with what I have defines me. In a world of social media, we absolutely define our worth based on what we show other people. And we judge other people's worth by what they show us. You know, we might not even realize that's what we're doing, but that's what's going on in our heads. That's why we like it whenever we post something and people interact with it. There's also the story of moral relativism, another one you've probably never heard of, but you for sure have encountered the idea, well, that's my truth. It's the idea that we get to decide what is true. But the problem with that is it means that I can say one thing, you can say something else, and they can both be true, and they can be completely contradictory. So you see the problem with that? And then the fourth one is postmodern tribalism. Again, words that you don't know, but you absolutely have encountered. So this is where your family group or your followers are the ones who define what matters most. So basically, it's individualism and it's postmodern relativism, moral relativism, to the heightened extent. What matters most about me is what the people around me affirm about me and what they think matters most. So these are the stories that we're up against. But today in Exodus, we're going to see a different story, the story of the gospel that's going to push against these ideas. And so my invitation for you today is to look at this story from Exodus chapter 11 and think about how it pushes back against these other stories in your life. So Exodus 11:1 is where we're starting. If you want to turn there today, it's page 92 here in the Pew Bible. It will also be on the screen. We're going to continue to look at the story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. And so we're going to look at Exodus 11, chapter 1. So let's take a look together as we see how the story that Pharaoh believes comes in contact with the story of God. Chapter 11:1 starts this way. Now the Lord had said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he does, he will drive you out completely. Now, if you haven't been with us until today, this is our 5th week in Exodus. And so by now, it's not really possible for me to catch you up. So what I would say is listen today, and then if you go to salemmagleychurch.com or if you go to YouTube and put in Salem Magley Church, If you go to Apple Podcast app and put in Salem Magley Church, you can listen to the rest of the sermons there. I encourage you to do that, to catch up. What I will say is last week, Moses and the Israelites saw 9 plagues be brought against Egypt. And after every one of those plagues, Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go to worship God in the wilderness. And so now what we see here is God says, the Lord Yahweh says to Moses, okay, I'm going to bring one more plague, and now, after this plague, they're going to basically kick you out of the land. So whatever this plague is, it's not going to be good. So if we jump down to verse 4, we actually get to see what the plague is. So this is what Moses tells Pharaoh. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. So a couple of things. First, last week, Moses and Pharaoh were trying to negotiate the Israelites going into the wilderness to worship God. And Pharaoh he ended the negotiations by saying, you need to leave. And so what's happening here on the way out is Moses is saying, okay, I'm going to leave and you won't see me again, but just so you know, this is what's coming next. So he warns Pharaoh. Now, before we look at Pharaoh's response, I do think it's important to acknowledge that this seems like a very drastic plague, and it makes people uncomfortable. So let me just remind you of a couple things. We were told from the beginning that it might end up here. Pharaoh was told time and time again, you have enslaved my firstborn son, Israel, and I want you to let them go. Now remember, not only did he enslave them, but the Pharaoh before this one, the one who originally enslaved them, he first tried to have their children murdered by midwives, and then he told his people to throw their children, the young boys who were born, into the Nile River. So Pharaoh has already done horrible evils against Israel. And Yahweh hasn't forgotten because he is just. Now we're going to talk about how that still might make us uncomfortable here in a moment. But that's what's going on here. So how is Pharaoh going to respond? We jump down to verse 10, and this is what we're told. Well, I guess the first question, will the Israelites be affected by this plague? And this is what we're told. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark or any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. So in the past, some of the plagues had affected Israel, like the Nile plague. I mean, they also wouldn't have been able to drink the Nile River water. They would have had to find water somewhere else. But some of the plagues only affected Egypt. And this one is also only going to affect Egypt. Now, when it says the dogs won't be barking, they didn't have dogs like pets. Their dogs were like scavengers that just roamed the streets. And so what this is just saying is that the Egyptians are going to be in chaos, but the Israelites are going to be in peace. Not even the streets will have dogs roaming that night. It's a distinction between Yahweh and Israel and Pharaoh and the Egyptians. If you remember, that's because this is all a showdown between the gods. Pharaoh, who's the god of Egypt, and Yahweh, who's the God of Israel. So this showdown is going to end. Now, is Pharaoh going to finally relent? Verse 10. Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his country. Now, it says that God hardened his heart, but it's more complex than that. If you remember, there was times where Pharaoh also hardened his heart. And here's what's really going on underneath all of this. Pharaoh believed a certain story. Like I said, we all have a worldview of story that we live by. Pharaoh's story was, I am the king of the greatest ancient country, and I am a son of the gods. How dare this God of my slaves tell me what to do? Pharaoh could not give in to Yahweh because of the story he believed. So the question you need to ask yourself, does my story stop me from hearing God? The story that I believe, is it standing in my way from doing the work of God or doing the will of God? we can't forget that nothing is greater than our God. That should be central to the story that we live. But Pharaoh didn't have that part. And so Pharaoh says, okay, I'm not listening to you. So that means the plague is coming. So how is this going to affect Israel? Well, this is what we're told next. We go to chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, "This month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household." So it seems as if the story goes in a completely different direction. But that's because Israel is about to have a worldview, a story-defining moment. And when they have this moment, it's going to change their whole world, their whole story that they live. And so this story is going to impact them so deeply that it's going to reorient their lives. And so God is preparing them for that by saying, okay, you're going to do this every year. And this is going to be your first month. And what he tells them is each family needs to get a lamb. So what are they to do with this lamb? Verse 6. This is what he says. "Take care of them, the lamb, until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight." So this lamb that comes into the house on the 10th day, lives there for a couple days, and then it's slaughtered. This automatically makes me think of the story, and I don't know if this story is true, but you probably heard it, of Abraham Lincoln's son Todd. So Todd was his son in the White House. One year, the story goes, the family's turkey came for the Thanksgiving dinner, and Todd fell in love with this turkey, and he did not want it to be butchered for the family meal. And so they had to find a solution. And the story goes that this is why every year U.S. presidents pardon one turkey at Thanksgiving. Now, I don't know if they still do this. Okay, I'm telling people, don't tell me they do. Like, I remember I used to watch The West Wing, and it was always a big episode when they pardoned the turkey. And I think there's a movie. Annette, is there a movie that's about the pardoned turkey? Yeah, so it's a thing, okay? Unfortunately, the lambs didn't get pardoned. But that's what makes me think of, you bring these lambs into your house for a couple days, and all of a sudden it has to become your food. Because after it's butchered or slaughtered, this is what happens. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lamb. So a couple of things we learn here. Well, they're going to eat the lamb, so it's a part of this meal. So it is the main course of a meal. And they take some of the blood and they wipe it on the sides of the door and on the top, which is a very gross sounding thing. Because I'm thinking about like what happens after it's been there for a while. And like I haven't butchered animals or been around animal blood, you know, and most of us probably haven't. But those of you who have, like the thought of that. So why are they doing this? Why do they do this? Well, we're going to talk about that in a moment, but first let's just acknowledge this lamb is part of a special meal that they're going to have. And this meal is going to become the meal that identifies the Israelites and defines them. This is going to become the Passover meal. And this is going to be the Passover lamb. So this lamb is butchered, and there's a lot of very specific instructions about the meal. I'll skip all of those. You can read them on your own. Maybe we'll talk about them for the Bible study. Most likely not, because there's so much to talk about. The details are like the last thing that you want to talk about when you think about all the other things. But there's lots of details about it. So a couple of questions. Okay, so how is Israel going to escape the plague? We haven't really defined that. And we haven't really defined what's up with the blood. Now, you might know where it's going, you might not. So let's find out what happens next. Verse 12. This is what we're told. On that same night, that's the same night that they butcher and eat the lamb, I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animal. And I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. And then he says this, verse 13. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. So now the blood and the way they avoid the plague becomes clear. The lamb that is slaughtered for the meal is actually a sacrifice who dies in place of the firstborn. And the blood of the lamb is the sign that protects the firstborn of the Israelites from death. And so what that means is whenever the angel of death comes into Egypt, all firstborns are supposed to be taken back to God. And there's a whole theme about that we don't have time to talk about it. If you listen to the Bible Project podcast, they have a whole theme about the firstborn and the redemption of the firstborn. It goes all the way back to Abraham. Remember, he tried to create his own firstborn son, Ishmael, and then that didn't work, so then he had a second firstborn son, Isaac. But then what does God ask him to do? He asks him to sacrifice Isaac. But in the end, what does he do? He actually provides a blameless lamb in place of Isaac. And now the firstborns are being called again. Because the firstborn is like a blessing from God. It's like the first fruits of the crop. And so you offer it back to God. And so God is coming for the firstborns. But he provides a way for them to be saved. This is important. Anybody could have done the Passover meal in Egypt and had their son or daughter, their firstborn, but most likely it would have been a son in that culture, saved. So we see that God isn't like Pharaoh at all. Yahweh, though, he says, yes, the firstborn are due to me out of a blessing. I will provide a way for you to redeem them. And then later on, there's even a whole series of instructions about that later that we're going to skip as well. So this lamb becomes the source of salvation for the firstborns. And then beyond that, because of the firstborn plague, Egypt sends Israel away. So this becomes the reason that they're saved. It's all because of the Passover lamb, the sacrifice that protects Israel, that dies in their place. Now, what's interesting is that this meal isn't just something they celebrate once. I've already alluded to this. Look what they're told as part of this process. First, they're told this: celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. And then also verse 24, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants when you enter the land and that the Lord will give you, as he promised. Observe this ceremony. So unleavened bread is the feast. Passover lamb is the sacrifice. They're celebrated together. With the unleavened bread feast, there's all these specific instructions, and the bread didn't have yeast because there wasn't time to prepare it. They knew that they'd be leaving the next day, so they had to make bread in haste, and there wasn't time for it to rise. And so it's the festival of unleavened bread, and the meal is the Passover meal, and it's the feast of unleavened bread. So they all go together, and they're supposed to celebrate it regularly because it's how they remember that God delivered them from the Egyptians. So why is it so important for them to do it regularly? This is what we're told, verse 26. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? Then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. So the reason that they do this every year is to remember. Years down the road, they want to remember this worldview defining moment. They are the people who were saved by Yahweh from Egypt by the Passover lamb. That is centrally who they are. And they want to be able to teach every generation that story. The best way to teach it is they actually relive it every year. And so the kids, they participate in it, they learn about it, and they say, Mommy, why did we do this? Kids ask a million questions, right? And it's an opportunity to teach. And it's how they live and be a part of that meal every year. Now, here's what's interesting. All right, so this was what in Egypt first. It's how they were brought out of Egypt. And we're going to read about that next week. But this isn't the end of the Passover meal, because it becomes central to Jesus and his followers as well. So first, and there's no verses for any of these, I'm just going to tell you. John the Baptist calls Jesus the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And this happens when a couple of his disciples are with him in the Gospel of John, and Jesus walks by, and he says, there goes the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And then later, another book written by John the book of Revelation, there's this encounter where there's a scroll that needs to be opened, and the person in the vision's like, oh, well, who can open it? Nobody. And then the messenger says, oh, wait, look, there, the Lion of Judah. The Lion of Judah can open the scroll. But then whenever he looks, he doesn't see a lion. He sees the slain lamb, whose blood was the sacrifice for all the nations. And when we read the New Testament, there's different places where it talks about Jesus' blood was shed so the whole world might be saved. Like the Passover lamb's blood was shed so that the firstborns and then Israel might be saved. Also, in John's gospel, if you read it carefully, John sets Jesus up to be the Passover sacrifice. In John's gospel, this Passover hasn't happened, and Jesus is actually crucified on the Passover. Whenever they're supposed to be crucifying the lamb, Jesus is crucified. He is the new Passover lamb. And not only is it the gospel and New Testaments that do this, but Jesus himself, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that the Last Supper is actually a Passover feast. And they have the whole feast, and at the end of the feast, what does Jesus do? He stands up and he has bread and he has wine, and he says, this is my body broken for you. Take it, eat it in remembrance of me. And then he says, this is my blood poured out for many. Drink it in remembrance of me. He has a new Passover feast that he gives to his followers. And he says, do this to remember what I'm going to do for you on the cross. And just like you eat the Passover, you're going to eat my body and you're going to drink my blood. Like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so we might be saved. Passover is fulfilled. It makes its completeness in the story of Jesus. Passover in Exodus is the beginning of what God will do with his son on the cross. Like the Passover lamb, Jesus dies so that we might be saved. So this is the event that helps us best understand the cross. Passover is the meal that also best helps us undertake or understand Holy Communion. Because this is the Passover meal that we were given by Jesus. Because like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so that we might be saved. So here in Exodus, the Passover is the moment where God saves Israel and brings them out of Egypt. It's how he saves them. It's their story-defining moment. Now for us, our story-defining moment is Jesus on the cross. That is how we're supposed to understand the world. We worship a God who loves us, who made us, who looks at all of our faults and says, it doesn't matter. And he comes, and then he offers himself as a sacrifice for us. Like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so we might be saved. And so this is why we celebrate communion regularly, because it's how we remember. And I don't know if you've noticed, but over the years, we've slowly done it more and more. It's because when we celebrate communion, we're telling the story that defines us, the story that defines our world. And when we do it, we remember that God saved us through the sacrifice of his own son. So like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so that we might be saved. So this Passover connection to communion, it should shape the way we see the world. It should shape how we understand all of life. And when we remember, we relive the story. This is also why I've always advocated for kids participating in Holy Communion. Because if this is our Passover meal, it's an opportunity for learning. It's an opportunity for kids to be a part of the story as they learn the story. It's an opportunity, like the Israelite children were a part of the family and the people of God, and they celebrated the Passover and they learned about it. And yeah, maybe sometimes they weren't the most respectful by adult standards, but they are kids. We don't know how they might be learning when they encounter God in those moments. So that's why I'm okay with it, but I've always said whatever each family chooses is their decision. I'm happy to let that be a family choice. But this is the reason behind the way I do what I do and the way that I talk about it when I'm asked about it. Because like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so that we might be saved. So this defining moment in Israel's history becomes a defining moment in our story as well. And as we're going to see, this is going to get Israel out of Egypt. And they're going to be set free like God said he would do. But that just opens the door for a whole new world that they need to be ready for. And that's what we get to look at next. So this week, may we not forget that like the Passover lamb, Jesus died so we might be saved. And may we not forget that communion is our world-defining moment. It's how we understand our story. So may we never forget, may we always remember, and may we come to the table often.